Okay, I'm with Chris Williamson outside the Monument for the London FBU march going towards City Hall about the London fire cuts, and he's going to tell you a little bit about the risks of privatisation and what the Tories have been up to.
Yeah, well, Brandon Lewis, who is the Fire Minister, has made it very clear that they are seriously considering privatisation despite their protestations to the contrary. He took a paper through to the obscure House of Commons committee called the House of Commons Regulatory Reform Committee, which actually talks about enabling wholesale externalisation of all fire and rescue services. He was doing it on the basis of saying that would be necessary to enable Cleveland Fire Authority to create a mutual in that part of the country. But the problem with that is twofold, really. Firstly, in order to achieve what he said he wanted to achieve in Cleveland, he would open the door for other fire authorities to just simply externalise the fire and rescue service without even bothering to establish a mutual. And the second problem is, even if Cleveland or anywhere else for that matter establishes a mutual, after 3 years they have to then re-tender the fire and rescue service, and it has to be an open tender, and that could mean that the private sector could come in and take over the contract. So that's a very real fear, a very real worry, and in spite of what Eric Pickle says, what Sir Brandon Lewis says, that they would do nothing that would lead to privatisation, they are still persisting with this mutualisation agenda, and so we're continuing to press them to actually drop that and to make sure that the fire and rescue service remains in public ownership.
Okay, thank you for that. Obviously, today we're here about the London fire cuts that Boris Johnson's pushing through despite his own fire authority rejecting them. Obviously, Eric Pickles recently said at the LGA conference that 3 parties have accepted that public spending needs to be brought under control, which raises the question, how would Labour be different to the Tories with regards to the cuts agenda that's being pushed through the fire service?
It's about priorities, isn't it? I mean, I think we're going to inherit a very difficult set of figures when we hopefully win the next general election. But what we've said is that we'll make different choices, we'll have different priorities. And as far as I'm concerned, the blue light services, particularly the fire and rescue service that I'm responsible for as the Shadow Fire Minister, should be prioritised. At the end of the day, this is about saving people's lives. And I think people need a strong public sector run fire and rescue service to make sure that they can sleep safely in their beds. And it isn't just about, of course, rescuing people from fires. The fire and rescue service, there's a much bigger emphasis these days on the rescue part of what they do. The increased flooding incidents, for example, is an area that obviously needs to be supported. So what we would say is we would have different priorities. We would prioritise the fire and rescue service, and we'd also invest in the economy to generate the tax revenue which can then be invested in public services, so we don't have to go through this totally counterproductive austerity programme which failed in the 1930s and is failing today.
Yes. So it's a very valid point there you made about water rescue flooding incidents. Am I right in saying that the Fire Brigades Union have called for the government to make it a statutory duty under the Fire and Rescue Services Act to attend flooding incidents, but they at the minute refusing to do that because obviously they'll have to put their hand in a pocket to provide the equipment for it. At the minute it's coming out of brigades' budgets, and as you rightly said, flooding incidents are increasing.
They are increasing, and with climate change we're going to see more of that, and I support a statutory responsibility. This is something that we are looking at now in the Labour Party as we go forward developing our policy prospectus for the Fire and Rescue Service after the next general election. I do think it does make sense, but we're in discussions with colleagues about that, and the Labour government, previous Labour government, did inject a big slug of money into the Fire and Rescue Service around the country to fund a lot of flood rescue assets to bring the fire and rescue service in the country up to speed. But the problem is that investment went in several years ago, and unless that's renewed, then those assets that were purchased at that time will start to fall into disrepair, and without the resources and without the statutory responsibility, it's unlikely that they will be replaced. So that's a very real pressure, and we need to look at that, and that's why we're going through this process, this policy review at the moment, to look at not just the flood rescue responsibilities, but the whole range of other activities that the Fire and Rescue Service is responsible for and could be responsible for. So I think there's other areas that firefighters could usefully be engaged in, actually utilising their expertise and their skills. And the fact that they have this, what I call the Heineken effect, they can reach parts that other statutory agencies can't. And so the work that's done with, with young people, the work that's done with older citizens is really important. I think it's, really key that we to look to roll out that type of activity across the country.
Okay, and just finally, it'd be remiss of me not to mention it, seeing as it's a very key issue for firefighters at the minute. The government Public Sector Pensions Act being pushed through. 60 now is the normal pension age for a firefighter, but their own report said that large proportions of the current workforce won't make it to 60, and they will be now facing capability dismissal. Brandon Lewis has said that that's an issue for local authorities and that the government won't take any responsibility for it.
This is just the latest set of pernicious pieces of legislation that the government has pushed through, and Brandon Lewis, Eric Pickles, they like to sort of wash their hands of any responsibility and say, well, this is just a matter for local fire and rescue authorities, but they're setting the legislative framework. And the Williams review that you referred to was very clear that on current sort of fitness levels on which firefighters are recruited into the fire and rescue service, the vast majority of them, when they get over 55, are not going to meet the capability requirements. And I've urged Brandon Lewis and urge him again to get round the negotiating table, to negotiate in good faith, because as far as I'm concerned, they've been negotiating in bad faith with the FBU. The FBU has been prepared to negotiate. They've put forward compromise proposals on the table, and I would urge Brandon Lewis to take them up and move forward, because the last thing this country needs is a full-scale firefighter strike. But I fear that Brandon Lewis is pushing the FBU in that direction.
It's the last thing any of us want to do, but at the minute, as you say, they're not listening to their own arguments and they're not listening to our arguments, and we're being kind of backed into a corner. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. This is Chris Williamson, the Shadow Fire Minister, and this is We Save People, Not Banks.